There's a sound that every parent knows, the sound of a house full of children, shoes on a tile floor, a cartoon playing in the next room, the particular chaos of 5 kids eating dinner together after a long day. It's noise. It's beautiful, exhausting, relentless noise. On the night of August 28, 2014, a house in Lexington County, South Carolina, went from that sound to silence. And for 9 days after that, 5 children who should have been in school, in daycare, playing in the yard, were sealed in garbage bags in the back of their father's SUV. Tonight, we're going inside one of the most disturbing cases in recent American history, a case about a father who killed 5 children aged 8 and then drove for over 1,000 miles trying to outrun what he had done. A case about a system that had warning signs and missed them. A case about the line between evil and madness, and whether that line even matters when 5 children are dead. This is the story of Timothy Ray Jones Jr. To understand what happened on that night in August, you have to start at the beginning, because Tim Jones Jr. did not arrive at that moment from nowhere. He was, in many ways, a man shaped by damage long before he inflicted any of his own. Timothy Ray Jones Jr. was born in Mississippi. His mother, Cynthia Turner, struggled with severe mental illness for most of his childhood. She would later be diagnosed with schizophrenia and institutionalized. From his earliest years, Tim Jr. grew up in an unstable home where domestic violence was present, substance abuse was rampant, and the adults around him were often more burden than support. His father, Tim Jones Sr., would eventually take custody of his son and try to provide some structure, but the damage had already taken root. By his early teens, Jones Jr. was using drugs and alcohol. At 15, he was in a car with a cousin who was driving drunk when they crashed into a tree. Jones Jr. was hospitalized for 2 days with a traumatic brain injury, an injury that, according to testimony, changed him. People who knew him before and after the accident said he became more paranoid, more erratic, more prone to darkness. The hallucinations reportedly started around then. He joined the Navy as a young man looking, he said, for the discipline of it. He was discharged after 6 weeks, caught with drugs. The pattern continued. By 2001, he'd been arrested for forgery, car theft, and cocaine possession. He was 19 years old, and then somehow things stabilized. Jones Jr. turned himself around, or appeared to. He channeled his considerable intelligence into computer engineering. He earned a degree. He got a job as a software engineer, working for a company that contracted with the federal government. He was, by all professional accounts, smart, technically gifted, functional. In 2004, he married a woman named Amber Kaiser. They had 5 children together: Mara, born in 2006, Elias, born in 2007, Natan, born in 2008, Gabriel, born in 2012, Abigail, born in 2013. To the outside world, it looked like Tim Jones Jr. had beaten his demons. He hadn't. The marriage unraveled slowly at first, then all at once. By 2011, tensions in the home were bad enough that the State Department of Social Services opened an investigation after Jones accused Amber of neglecting the children. Investigators found the home in disarray but closed the case. The couple remained together, barely. In May 2012, they separated briefly. When Jones returned to the shared home, he discovered his wife had been sneaking out at night, meeting a 19-year-old neighbor. The affair confirmed fears that Jones had carried since childhood, the fear of abandonment. His therapist would later note in depositions that Jones did not want to feel abandoned by his wife. The divorce proceedings that followed were bitter and controlling. Jones isolated Amber from her friends and family, cutting off her support network and her finances, ensuring that when the custody fight came, she had no job, no lawyer, and no resources. In October 2013, the divorce was finalized. Timothy Jones Jr. was awarded full custody of all 5 children. Amber was granted visitation, supervised by him, every other weekend. Most of those visits happened at a Chick-fil-A in Lexington, South Carolina. Jones moved the children into a mobile home in Lexington County and resumed his career as a software engineer. On paper, he was a single father, raising 5 young children while holding down a demanding technical job. Social workers who visited the home in August 2014, just 2 weeks before the murders, filed a report noting that Jones appears to be overwhelmed, but that the children appear to be clean, groomed, and appropriately dressed. What that report did not capture, what none of the official check-ins captured, was what Amber had been desperately trying to tell anyone who would listen. She had been calling DSS, warning them that the children were in danger, that Jones was deteriorating, that he was smoking synthetic marijuana, commonly called spice, heavily and daily, that his behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and frightening. Nobody acted on those warnings in time. August 28, 2014. A Thursday. From the moment Tim Jones Jr. woke up that morning, everything about his day was unraveling. He was under pressure at work. A major project was due. He was smoking spice throughout the day to manage the stress. The synthetic marijuana he was using is not like conventional marijuana. Spice is unpredictable, dangerous, and in high doses can trigger acute psychosis. Users have reported paranoid delusions, violent outbursts, and complete breaks from reality. Jones smoked it at work. He smoked more at home before leaving to pick up the children. He collected all 5 of them, Abigail and Gabriel from a neighbor's house where they'd been staying, and the 3 older children from their after-school program. He stopped and bought takeout for dinner. They came home, they ate, and then Jones noticed that an electrical outlet in the house wasn't working. He accused 6-year-old Nitan of tampering with it. Nitan had what family members described as an unusual fascination with electricity and had been in trouble before for touching outlets and wiring he shouldn't have touched. Whether Nitan was responsible this time, nobody will ever know, but Jones had decided he was. What followed was not a punishment. It was torture. Jones forced 6-year-old Nitan to perform strenuous physical exercise, calisthenics, repeated drills as punishment. He pushed the child until Nitan could no longer stand. Pathologists would later theorize that the combination of extreme physical exertion, possible dehydration, and the stress on a small body caused Nitan to collapse and die. Nitan was years old. Jones did not call 911. He did not call anyone, according to his own confession, audio of which was played in the courtroom at his trial. Jones found his son's body. Then he picked up his phone and watched a scene from a movie. Then he made a decision that defines this case. He decided that all 5 of his children needed to die. According to his confession, he told investigators that he wanted them all to go to heaven together. Over the next several hours, he killed 4 more of his children. He strangled 8-year-old Mara with his hands. He strangled 7-year-old Elias with his hands. For 2-year-old Gabriel and 1-year-old Abigail, whose necks were too small for his hands, he used a belt. By morning, all 5 children were dead. The oldest was 8, the youngest 1. Now, here is where the case takes on its particular grim strangeness. Jones did not flee immediately. He did not call police. He did not apparently experience any dramatic breakdown in the hours after the killings. Instead, he began to manage the situation. He wrapped the bodies of his 5 children in black garbage bags. He loaded them into the back of his SUV, and then he drove. For 9 days. He drove through South Carolina, through Georgia, through Alabama, through Mississippi. He stopped for gas. He spoke to people. At one point, he apparently told someone the bags in his vehicle contained dead animals. The vehicle, according to witnesses who encountered him during those 9 days, smelled strongly of decomposition and bleach. Throughout this time, the children's mother, Amber Kaiser, had no idea where her children were. She'd spoken to Mara by phone the evening of August 28th, a brief, normal call, and then the calls stopped. Jones wasn't answering. The children weren't reachable. On September 3rd, 6 days after the murders, Amber reported her children missing. A search began on September 6, 2014. 9 days after the killings, a deputy in Smith County, Mississippi, pulled Jones over at a routine DUI checkpoint. The officer smelled something. Not marijuana, something else, something wrong. He found blood in the vehicle, drug paraphernalia, and the smell of decomposition that no amount of bleach had fully masked. Jones was arrested on the spot for driving under the influence and drug possession, and then he confessed. In his confession, delivered in what investigators and reporters in the courtroom would later describe as a flat, detached tone, Jones admitted to killing all 5 children. He led police to a remote hillside in Wilcox County, Alabama, where he had dumped the garbage bags. The bodies of Mara, Elias, Natan, Gabriel, and Abigail Jones were recovered. DNA testing confirmed their identities. Mara Jones was 8 years old. Elias Jones was 7. Natan Jones was 6. Gabriel Jones was 2. Abigail Jones was 1. Tim Jones Jr. was transported back to Lexington County, South Carolina, to face charges. He was 32 years old, a former Navy enlistee, a software engineer, a single father who had fought for and won custody of his 5 children, and then killed every one of them. The case sat for nearly 5 years before it went to trial. The delay was due in large part to the central legal and psychiatric question that would define the proceedings. Was Timothy Jones Jr. insane? His defense team built their case around a portrait of catastrophic mental disintegration. They called more than 24 witnesses, relatives, friends, mental health experts. They described a man with a mother institutionalized for schizophrenia, a teenager who suffered traumatic brain injury in a drunk driving crash, a young adult whose drug and alcohol use had compounded those injuries over years, a man who had, since his arrest, been diagnosed with schizophrenia himself and placed on multiple psychotropic medications. Defense attorney Rob Madsen used a striking metaphor in his opening argument. He compared Jones's mind to a diseased forest, each trauma another sick tree. And on the night of August 28th, Tim's forest was on fire. Jones, his lawyers argued, genuinely believed his children were going to harm him. His confession had included the claim, jarring and bizarre, that he feared the children were going to kill him, chop him up, and feed him to the dogs. That was not the rational mind of a murderer, the defense said. That was psychosis. The prosecution's response was direct and unsparing. Deputy Solicitor Sean Graham told jurors in his opening statement, "Timothy Jones Jr. is not a father. He's not insane. He's a murderer." The prosecution focused on the sequence of decisions Jones had made. He hadn't called 911 when Natan collapsed. He'd watched a movie clip. He'd then methodically killed 4 more children. He'd wrapped the bodies. He'd driven 9 days. He'd told people the bags were dead animals. Each of those choices, the state argued, demonstrated a man who knew exactly what he'd done and was trying to cover it up, not a man lost in a psychotic break. The expert witnesses clashed bitterly. Defense psychiatrists testified that Jones was schizophrenic and couldn't distinguish right from wrong at the time of the killings. Prosecution psychologists testified that his behavior showed no signs of schizophrenia, that his disorganized thought patterns were consistent with the stress of his divorce and custody situation, not a clinical psychotic episode. And then there was the audio of Jones's confession, played for the courtroom, his flat, almost clinical voice describing what he had done to each child. It was, by all accounts, devastating to hear. The trial lasted weeks. The jury deliberated. On June 11, 2019, nearly 5 years after the murders, the jury found Timothy Ray Jones Jr. guilty on all 5 counts of murder. The sentencing phase began immediately, and in its own way, the testimony during sentencing added another dimension to a case that already defied easy categorization. Tim Jones Sr., the defendant's father, took the stand. He testified for over 3 hours. He described his son's childhood, his mentally ill mother, his traumatic upbringing. He removed his shirt and tie in front of the jury to show them the tattoos across his back, the 5 faces of his murdered grandchildren, rendered in permanent ink. He asked the jury to spare his son's life. He said he did not want to lose anyone else. "December 2012 is the last time I saw my babies alive," Jones Sr. told the jury. When law enforcement had approached him after the arrest, trying to get him to help extract information from his son about the children's whereabouts, Jones Sr. said he already knew in his heart that the worst had happened. The defense also called Amber Kaiser, the children's mother, the ex-wife. She asked the jury not to execute the father of her children. She had already lost everything. She did not want this to end in another death. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a sentence of death. Timothy Ray Jones Jr. was formally sentenced to death and sent to death row at Broad River Correctional Institution in South Carolina. He did not testify at any point during the trial or sentencing. He declined to make a final statement to the jury. They heard his voice only through recordings of his confession. Jones appealed the conviction and sentence, raising a series of legal challenges including the qualification of certain jurors and evidentiary rulings made during the trial. In March 2023, the South Carolina Supreme Court reviewed the case in its entirety and affirmed both the conviction and the death sentence. The court found that while some evidentiary errors had occurred during the trial, those errors were harmless and had not altered the outcome. The conviction stands. The death sentence stands. As of today, Timothy Ray Jones Jr. remains on death row in South Carolina. He has not spoken with his father since the trial concluded. According to local media reports, Amber Kaiser, the mother of Mara, Elias, Nathan, Gabriel, and Abigail, has spoken publicly on multiple occasions since the verdict. She has become an advocate for children's rights and for reform of the processes by which protective services evaluate parental fitness and respond to reports of danger. She had warned DSS that her children were at risk. She had made those calls. The system did not act in time. Now, let's talk about something this case forces us to genuinely wrestle with, because it's uncomfortable and it matters. Was Timothy Jones Jr. mentally ill? Almost certainly in some form. The hereditary markers were there. His mother had schizophrenia. He had a documented traumatic brain injury at 15. He had a long history of substance abuse, including synthetic drugs that are documented to induce psychotic states. He had been prescribed multiple psychiatric medications after his arrest, medications that appeared to stabilize him. His behavior in the 9 days after the murders, the driving, the garbage bags, the story about dead animals, reads as someone both trying to cover their tracks and dissociating from what they had done. These are not simple facts to dismiss. But the jury was not asked to determine whether Jones was mentally ill. They were asked a more specific question under South Carolina law. At the time of the killings, did he lack the capacity to distinguish moral or legal right from wrong? And on that question, the jury said no. The prosecution had argued, and the jury accepted, that a man who methodically kills 4 more children after the first one dies, then spends 9 days managing the bodies, telling lies, driving across state lines, is not a man who has lost the ability to understand what he is doing. He might be deeply ill. He might be broken in ways that defy simple description. But he knew enough to run. There is no clean answer here. There is only 5 dead children. The case of Timothy Ray Jones Jr. sits at the intersection of several of the most difficult conversations in American life: the failures of the child welfare system, the intersection of mental illness and criminal responsibility, the limitations of the institutions we trust to protect children, and the question of what we owe to victims when the person who hurt them is also, in some ways, a product of damage that was done to them. None of those conversations bring Mara, Elias, Natan, Gabriel, or Abigail back. What we know is this: 5 children went to school and daycare on August 28, 2014. They came home. They ate dinner. The oldest was 8, old enough to sense when something was wrong, old enough to have been frightened. The youngest was 1, and none of them were protected. The system had been warned. DSS had visited that home. Amber Kaiser had made calls. The social worker's report from 2 weeks before the murders said Jones seemed overwhelmed. Overwhelmed was the word in the file. Not dangerous, not a threat. Overwhelmed. And in the gap between overwhelmed and danger, 5 children died. Amber Kaiser has said publicly that no verdict, no sentence, no outcome of the legal process gave her anything back. Her words to reporters were quiet, devastated, and clear. The children never had a chance. Tim Jones Sr. still carries his grandchildren on his back. Literally, in the tattoos he showed the jury, 5 faces, 5 names. He tore down the pool he built for them in his backyard because the memories were too painful. He built it for them. He watched it fill with water and with their laughter. And then one day, his son drove off with their bodies in garbage bags and did not call. I remember he said, "Would you like to talk to the children?" Jones Sr. told journalists, recalling a phone call with his son just days before the murders. I said, "You know what, Timmy? Let's surprise them. They'll be really happy." And the next day, he went missing. He was going to surprise them. They loved visiting Papa's big house, as the children called it. They loved the pool. That is the world those 5 children lived in. A world of grandpas with big houses and pools, of phone calls with their mother, of an after-school program they attended every day because their father worked long hours of a fast food dinner on a Thursday night. And then their father's forest caught fire and they had nowhere to run. Mara Jones, Elias Jones, Natan Jones, Gabriel Jones, Abigail Jones. 8, 7, 6, 2, 1. Say their names. That's all. That's the only thing left that belongs entirely to them. Their names, their ages, the specific weight of the silence their absence left behind. Timothy Ray Jones Jr. sits on death row tonight. The South Carolina Supreme Court has confirmed he will die there by execution for what he did to them. Whether that counts as justice is a question you'll have to answer for yourself. What it doesn't count as, what it can never count as, is enough. If this case raises concerns about the safety of children in your life, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-422-4453. If you found this video important, please share it. These children deserve to be remembered. subscribe for more true crime documentaries, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. The Girl with the Suitcase. Busan, South Korea, May 27, 2023, 3:02 in the morning. The city is quiet in a way that only certain cities become quiet after midnight. The loud restaurants have finally emptied. The neon signs still glow, but now they illuminate almost nobody. Even the traffic sounds distant. A taxi moves slowly through the streets, searching for one last passenger before the driver decides to end his shift. Then he sees her, standing alone under a streetlight. A young girl beside a suitcase. At first, nothing about her seems dangerous. In fact, she looks harmless. Small frame, round glasses, short black bob haircut, a school uniform. She looks like a middle school student waiting for a ride home after studying too late. The taxi driver pulls over. He steps out automatically and opens the trunk. The suitcase immediately catches his attention. It looks unusually heavy, not because it's large, because of the way she drags it. The wheels struggle against the pavement as she pulls it closer to the car. The driver offers to help, but the girl quickly smiles and says, "No, it's okay. I can do it myself." Her voice is polite, soft, almost cheerful. So he lets her lift it herself. And for someone that small, she struggles more than he expected. The suitcase lands inside the trunk with a heavy thud, the kind of sound that stays in your memory later. The driver closes the trunk and gets back inside the taxi. Where to? The girl quietly gives him the destination, a riverside park near the Nakdong River. The driver pauses for half a second. Not enough to question her, but enough to feel something. Because people carrying luggage at 3 a.m. are usually going somewhere important. Train stations, airports, hotels. Not a dark riverside park. Still, he starts driving. And during the ride, he keeps glancing at her through the mirror. Not because she looks suspicious, because she doesn't. That's what bothers him later. She looks completely normal, calm, relaxed, almost emotionally empty. Outside the taxi windows, Busan slides past in silence, while the girl sits motionless in the back seat. No phone calls, no texting, no nervousness, just quiet. When they finally arrive near the riverside park, the driver pulls over. The girl thanks him politely. Again, she refuses help with the suitcase. This time, the driver notices something else, the way she grips the handle. Tight, like she's making sure it doesn't fall over. The suitcase rolls behind her as she walks toward the grassy riverside area until finally disappearing into the darkness. Most drivers probably would have left immediately, but something about the entire situation sits strangely with him. Not enough to call police, not enough to panic, just enough to stay. So he parks nearby and lights a cigarette. Maybe she needs another ride later. Maybe he's simply curious. Either way, he waits. 15 minutes pass, then 20, and finally, he sees her again, walking back toward the taxi. Only now the suitcase moves differently. Earlier, she struggled to pull it. Now it glides beside her effortlessly, and at that exact moment, something cold settles in the driver's stomach. Because suddenly, without understanding why, he realizes he is afraid of her. The girl gets back into the taxi, and for the second time that night, the ride begins in silence. But now the atmosphere feels heavier. The driver keeps checking the rearview mirror. The girl doesn't seem stressed, doesn't seem rushed, doesn't even seem emotional. If anything, she almost looks relieved. By the time he drops her off, he has already made his decision. He's going to call the police. Years of driving strangers around Busan had taught him something very important. Most danger announces itself loudly. But the truly frightening people sometimes look completely ordinary. And that phone call would uncover one of the most disturbing murder cases South Korea had seen in years, because hidden inside that suitcase had been dismembered human remains. And the quiet young girl inside the taxi was not a middle school student at all. Her name was Jung Yoo-Jung. She was 23 years old, and according to police, she had committed murder just hours earlier. But what horrified investigators even more than the crime itself was the reason she allegedly gave for killing, because according to Jung Yoo-Jung, she simply wanted to know what murder felt like. And as investigators began digging deeper into her life, they discovered something even more unsettling. Almost nobody truly knew her at all. Long before South Korea learned her name, Jung Yoo-Jung had already spent years disappearing in plain sight. Former classmates later described her using the exact same word: invisible, not bullied, not loud, not troubled, invisible. She rarely spoke at school. If classmates greeted her in the hallway, she often ignored them completely, not aggressively. Just as if human interaction itself exhausted her. Teachers remembered her as quiet but functional. Neighbors barely remembered seeing her outside. And after graduating high school in 2018, she seemed to slowly vanish from society altogether. While her classmates moved into universities, jobs, relationships, and adulthood, Jung Yoo-Jung remained mostly inside her home. According to investigators, she spent years telling her grandfather she was studying for government exams. But police later questioned whether she was truly preparing for anything at all, because during those years, her life became increasingly isolated. No social circle, no close friends, no stable career, and eventually, almost no connection to reality outside the internet. That isolation would become one of the most discussed aspects of this entire case, because investigators later discovered that Jung Yoo-Jung had developed an intense obsession with true crime, murder documentaries, serial killer content, crime analysis videos, hours and hours of it. Now, obviously, millions of people consume true crime content. That alone means absolutely nothing. But according to police, her fascination appeared different. Most people watch true crime to understand danger, psychology, fear, justice. Investigators believed Jung Yoo-Jung became fascinated with something else entirely: the killers themselves, how they felt, what they experienced emotionally, what murder felt like psychologically. And according to her confession, that curiosity eventually evolved into fantasy, then planning, then violence. But before investigators understood any of that, they first needed to reconstruct what happened inside the victim's apartment that night, because the victim had no idea she was opening her door to someone planning to kill her. She was simply trying to tutor a student. The victim was a university student in her 20s working as an English tutor. Like many students in South Korea, she used tutoring apps to earn money while attending school. And in South Korea, private education is taken extremely seriously. Parents spend enormous amounts of money trying to give their children academic advantages, especially in English. English tutoring isn't viewed as casual work there. Parents carefully search for tutors with strong academic backgrounds, prestigious universities, and verified credentials, which made the victim highly desirable on tutoring platforms. She was educated, professional, reliable. According to reports, Jung Yoo-Jung used this system to target her. Investigators later said she allegedly pretended to be the mother of a middle school student searching for an English tutor. At first, the victim reportedly refused because the location was inconvenient, but the fake mother continued insisting. Eventually, she agreed, and on the evening of May 26th, someone knocked on her apartment door. Standing outside was what appeared to be a shy teenage schoolgirl in a school uniform. But police later revealed something chilling. The uniform had allegedly been purchased online specifically for the murder. It was part of the disguise, and hidden underneath it. Investigators say Jung Yoo-Jung carried a knife. The victim invited her inside, and within minutes, the attack began. According to forensic reports, the victim was stabbed repeatedly in the neck. Again and again and again, the violence shocked investigators because of how focused it appeared. This didn't look impulsive, it looked intentional. And afterward, Jung Yoo-Jung didn't flee. She stayed inside the apartment for hours. That detail would deeply disturb investigators later, because according to CCTV footage collected across Busan, she behaved with almost impossible calmness after the killing. At multiple points during the night, surveillance cameras captured her casually walking through convenience stores purchasing garbage bags, bleach, cleaning supplies, and other items investigators believe were used to clean the scene. She didn't appear panicked, didn't appear rushed. At times, she almost appeared relaxed. That footage would later spread rapidly online across South Korea, and public reaction was immediate. Not because people saw graphic violence, but because viewers became disturbed by how ordinary she looked. The contrast was horrifying. A young woman casually walking through brightly lit stores while allegedly transporting body parts inside luggage. Investigators believe she spent most of the night cleaning the apartment and dismembering the victim's body before eventually placing remains into a suitcase. And then just before sunrise, she called the taxi. The same taxi driver whose instincts would ultimately expose everything. When police searched the Riverside Park after his report, they quickly discovered human remains scattered across the grassy area near the river. Nearby investigators also located bloody clothing and identification connected to the victim, and within hours, police traced everything back to Jung Yoo-Jung. 5 hours later, she was arrested, but even after her arrest, the lies continued. At first, according to investigators, she claimed the remains belonged to a baby she had secretly delivered herself. Police quickly disproved that story. Then she changed her explanation again, this time claiming she had only helped dispose of the body for someone else. Again, investigators didn't believe her. Eventually, she claimed she killed the victim after an argument. But even that explanation collapsed under investigation because the victim and Jung Yoo-Jung barely knew each other at all. And that became one of the most terrifying parts of the case. This appeared to be random, cold, almost experimental. Eventually, according to police, Jung Yoo-Jung confessed. And during questioning, she allegedly told investigators something that shocked the country. She said she committed the murder because she wanted to experience killing someone herself. Not revenge, not money, not hatred. Curiosity. That explanation horrified both the public and criminal psychologists. Because if true, it meant the victim was selected almost like part of an experiment, a complete stranger targeted simply because she was accessible. And investigators later discovered evidence suggesting the crime may have been planned for months. Police reportedly found searches related to hiding bodies, forensic evidence, and murder investigations. They also discovered that Jung Yoo-Jung had contacted multiple tutors before the killing, which raised an even darker question. What if she had succeeded without getting caught? Some criminal psychologists later stated they believed she likely would have killed again. And yet, even now, experts continue debating what truly motivated her. Because some psychologists believe her true crime obsession explanation may itself be manipulative. A constructed narrative, something dramatic enough to explain the crime publicly. Others believe her isolation, emotional detachment, and obsession with violent fantasy genuinely escalated into murder. But almost everyone agrees on one thing. Jung Yoo-Jung deeply unsettled investigators because she did not behave the way most killers behave after arrest, according to reports. She remained calm in custody. She ate normally, slept normally, and showed very little visible emotional distress. Even during media appearances, people noticed something strange about her demeanor. She apologized, but many viewers later said the apology felt rehearsed, almost copied, like someone imitating emotions rather than naturally expressing them. That perception only intensified public fear surrounding the case, because the more people watched her, the more emotionally distant she seemed. Eventually, she underwent psychological evaluations, including psychopathy assessments. Results reportedly suggested elevated psychopathic traits, though experts warned that such tests are not definitive answers by themselves. Still, public fascination with the case exploded because people desperately wanted to understand how someone so ordinary-looking could commit something so horrifying. And maybe the scariest answer of all is that nobody fully knows. Even now, there is no perfect explanation. No single moment investigators can point to and say, "This is exactly when she became dangerous." Instead, the case leaves behind something much more uncomfortable: the possibility that underneath an ordinary appearance, someone can quietly disconnect from humanity for years without anyone truly noticing. The taxi driver noticed something was wrong that night, not because he saw blood, not because he witnessed violence, but because instinct told him something about the girl felt unnatural. And had he ignored that instinct, the truth might never have been discovered so quickly. Because by the time police arrested Jung Yoo-Jung, investigators believe she had already spent months fantasizing about murder. And according to some experts, she may only have been getting started. That is what makes this case linger in people's minds long after hearing it. Not simply the brutality, but the silence surrounding it, the normality, the calmness, the fact that a person carrying unimaginable violence inside them could still look like an ordinary girl standing quietly beneath a streetlight at 3 in the morning, waiting for a taxi. There's a house in Fort Worth, Texas, that a man named Jim Walker still lives in today. It's the same house he was sleeping in on the night of February 17, 1974, when he was 12 years old. And if you ask him about that night, and people have for decades now, journalists and detectives and podcast hosts and documentary crews, he doesn't start with the crime scene. He doesn't start with the parking lot, or the culvert, or the 46 years that followed. He starts with a sound. It was somewhere around 1:45 in the morning, tires screeching against pavement outside, and then a voice, his sister's boyfriend, Rodney, screaming for Jim's father, screaming that they had her, that they were going to hurt her. Jim Walker was 12 years old, lying in the dark, listening to the exact moment his family's life split into a before and an after. He didn't know it yet. He just knew there was screaming outside, and his father was already moving toward the door. We're going to spend the next 50 minutes or so inside that split, the before and the after, and the 46-year gap that sat in between them, waiting for a piece of science that hadn't been invented yet to finally catch up. This is the story of Carla Walker. It's also the story of what it actually costs a family, in real years and real mornings, to wait that long for an answer, and what it finally took to give them one. To really feel what happened to Carla Walker, you have to first sit inside the world she was living in, because it's not the world we live in now, and the difference matters more than people usually give it credit for. Fort Worth in February of 1974 was a city caught in an interesting kind of in-between. It still carried its old identity: cattle, stockyards, a downtown that closed up early and stayed that way. But it was also growing fast, pulled forward by an aerospace industry that was reshaping entire neighborhoods around it. It was a city that hadn't fully decided yet whether it was a small town or a metropolis, And in that uncertainty, it kept a lot of small-town habits. Doors that didn't always get locked, teenagers who came and went at night without a second thought from their parents, because nobody had yet been given a strong enough reason to think twice. Bowling alleys in this era weren't just bowling alleys. They were one of the last stops on a teenage Saturday night, the place you swung by after a dance. Not because you needed to bowl, but because it was open, it was lit, it was safe, and everybody's friends might be there. Brunswick Riddle Bowl on the west side of the city was exactly that kind of place. A parking lot full of familiar cars, a building full of familiar faces, the kind of location that in 100 other versions of this same Saturday night meant absolutely nothing happened there at all. Here's the second piece of context that matters just as much as the first. In February of 1974, DNA wasn't a forensic tool. It wasn't even a forensic concept yet. Genetic fingerprinting, the idea that a person's biology could be read like a signature, was still 11 years away from being developed in a laboratory in England. And it would be nearly 2 more decades after that before American police departments used it as a matter of course. What that means is simple and worth sitting with before this story moves any further. If what happened to Carla Walker didn't produce a confession or an eyewitness who could identify a stranger face in the dark, or a piece of evidence that 1970s forensic science could actually use, it had a real serious chance of never being solved. Not because anyone would stop trying, because the tools to finish the job hadn't been built yet. Keep that thought close. It's going to become the entire engine of the second half of this story. Ask anyone who knew Carla Walker to describe her, and something interesting happens. The words don't really vary. Bright, popular, small in size, 5 feet tall at most, barely 100 pounds, but somehow never the smallest presence in a room. She was a junior at Western Hills High School. She had a wide circle of friends, the kind of social gravity that pulls people toward you without any visible effort. She had a boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, high school sweethearts, in the phrase both families would use for the rest of their lives to describe them. And she had a little brother, Jim, 12 years old, the kid down the hall who, like most younger siblings, watched his older sister with a kind of quiet, unspoken admiration he probably couldn't have put into words at the time, and would spend the rest of his life trying to put into words after. February 16, 1974, was a Saturday, the weekend nearest Valentine's Day, and Western Hills High School was holding its Valentine's dance. Carla went with Rodney. There were friends there, music, the particular electricity of a high school gymnasium dressed up to look like something more romantic than it usually is. By every account left behind, it was a good night, not a remarkable one. Not one anyone involved would have flagged in the moment as a night worth remembering in detail. Just a good ordinary Saturday. The kind that happens hundreds of times over in any given town, in any given year, and disappears from memory almost as soon as it ends. Except this one didn't disappear. This one became the last full night of Carla Walker's life. And the fact that nobody involved had any reason to know that yet is exactly what makes it worth slowing down for. After the dance wound down, Carla and Rodney didn't drive straight home. They made a stop that, on any other night, would have been the single most forgettable detail of the entire evening: Brunswick Riddle Bowl. So Carla could use the restroom before the drive back. Think about how small that decision is. It's not a choice. It's barely even a decision. It's the kind of stop that happens on autopilot, that nobody remembers making the next morning, that would never come up again in casual conversation for the rest of either of their lives. Rodney pulled into the lot. He stayed with the car. Carla went inside, came back out a few minutes later, and got back into the passenger seat. 5 minutes. That's roughly the entire span of time this stop was ever supposed to take. 5 minutes between an ordinary Saturday night and everything that came after it. And somewhere at the edge of that lot, in the dark beyond the reach of the building's lights, a man was already watching. What happened next took less time than it's going to take to describe it, which is its own kind of horror. The way violence compresses time, the way a single minute can hold an amount of damage that feels like it should require hours. The passenger door was torn open from the outside. A man was standing there, and he had a gun. Rodney McCoy would spend the rest of his life being asked to describe the next 60 seconds. And every version he's ever given lines up with the last one. The man pointed the pistol at him. He pulled the trigger more than once according to Rodney's account, and by some combination of malfunction and sheer chance, the gun didn't fire. Not one round left that chamber. That fact alone deserves a moment, because it's easy to let it slide past as a footnote. It isn't one. It means that in the opening seconds of this attack, Rodney McCoy came within a mechanical failure of not surviving the night either. The only reason there's a witness left alive to tell us anything about what happened in that parking lot is that a gun, for reasons nobody will ever fully know, didn't do what it was pointed there to. What came instead was the pistol itself, used as a club. Rodney was struck by his own account more than once, hard enough to split skin, hard enough that blood was running down into his eyes before he lost consciousness entirely. And in the seconds before the dark took him, Carla was already being pulled from the car. Rodney has said across every account he's given since that she was screaming, not for herself, but at the man attacking Rodney, telling him to stop hitting him. And then, as she was being dragged away, the last thing he ever heard her say was a request. Go get her father. Go get help. He didn't get the chance. The blows continued. Rodney went under. Sit with that for a second, because it's the detail that shapes everything that follows for the next 46 years of this story. Rodney McCoy did not get to make a single choice in the worst moment of his life. He wasn't given the option to fight harder, run faster, do one thing differently. He was unconscious for the entire span of time in which everything that mattered took place, and the guilt that leaves behind doesn't behave like ordinary guilt. It doesn't respond to logic, or to the fact that he did nothing wrong, or to anyone telling him there was nothing more he could have done. It just sits there for decades with nowhere to go. That's who Rodney McCoy would become for the next 46 years. The boy who was there and couldn't stop it and had to live inside that fact every single day after, somehow bleeding, disoriented, barely conscious. Rodney got himself moving. He made it to the Walker family home. It's around 1:45 in the morning. Jim Walker, 12 years old, is asleep in his room. And then he isn't, because there's a sound outside that doesn't belong in a quiet Fort Worth neighborhood at that hour, tires. And then a voice, raw and panicked, calling out for his father, telling him they had Carla, telling him they were going to hurt her. We opened this story with that exact moment, and it's worth returning to now that you understand everything sitting underneath it. That sound, a screaming teenager standing in a driveway at 1:45 in the morning, is the last piece of information the Walker family would have about Carla for the next 3 days. Everything after that sound is uncertainty. A police report, a search, a house that doesn't sleep. Jim Walker has said in the years since that this is the moment his life split into 2 parts. Not the discovery 3 days later, not the funeral. This one, lying in bed, 12 years old, hearing his family's world end through a bedroom wall before he even fully understood what the words meant. What follows is the part of this story that's hardest to compress into narration, because for the people living through it, it wasn't narration. It was just time. moving at the worst possible speed, with absolutely nothing to fill it except the specific dread of not knowing. Fort Worth police mobilized quickly. Search parties formed. Volunteers combed the areas around the bowling alley and beyond. And the Walker family did what every family in this position does. They waited. In a house that had only hours earlier been an entirely ordinary place and was now the center of a search for a missing 17-year-old girl. There is a specific, cruel arithmetic to a missing person's weight. Every hour that passes without information is technically neutral. No news, in the strictest sense, isn't bad news. But it doesn't feel neutral. It feels like the walls closing in 1 degree at a time. Because the human mind, denied real information, will always generate its own. And it rarely generates anything kind. On the third day, a passerby found a body in a drainage culvert off Pearl Ranch Road near Benbrook Lake, roughly 30 minutes outside the city where she'd been taken. It was Carla. The forensic findings that followed were as brutal as anything a family could be asked to absorb, and we're going to state them plainly rather than dwell in the details, because there's a difference between honoring the truth of what happened and lingering in it for effect. She had been raped. She had been beaten. She had been strangled. And based on what investigators were able to determine, she had been kept alive by her attacker for roughly 2 days before her death, which means the very worst chapter of Carla Walker's life wasn't the moment she was taken. It was the 2 days that came after. In a stretch of time no one outside of her killer would ever be able to fully account for. Fort Worth police now had a homicide investigation. What they didn't have yet was a name. Here's where this case for a moment looks like it's about to break wide open, and where you start to understand exactly how close it came, decades before anyone had the technology to actually close. At the scene of the abduction, investigators recovered a magazine for a .22 caliber Ruger pistol, apparently dropped in the struggle, lying near Carla's purse. One theory that would surface later, based on Rodney's account of being struck repeatedly with the weapon, is straightforward. In the chaos of pistol whipping a struggling victim, a hand can graze a release button without meaning to, and a magazine can simply fall. Whatever the exact mechanics, that magazine became one of the most specific, most promising leads in the entire 1974 investigation, because unlike a footprint or a fiber, a gun magazine points toward something concrete, a make, a model, a specific weapon that somebody somewhere had purchased. That search led investigators to a name: Glenn Samuel McCurley. McCurley owned a .22 caliber Ruger that used the same magazine type recovered from the scene. He also had a prior conviction for auto theft, which combined with the firearm match was more than enough to bring him in for formal questioning. Detectives sat him down. They asked him about the gun. He told them it had been stolen out of his truck. They asked him about Carla Walker. He said he'd never met her, and there, in an interview room in 1974, is where this case first touched the man who would eventually be convicted of it. 46 years before anyone would be able to prove it. Why didn't it end there? This is the question worth actually sitting with, rather than rushing past, because the honest answer says more about forensic science in the 1970s than it does about anyone's competence. Investigators had a matching gun type. They had a suspect with a prior record and a shaky story about a stolen weapon. What they didn't have, what nobody had anywhere in 1974, was any scientific method capable of taking biological evidence from that crime scene and definitively tying it to one specific human. DNA profiling wouldn't be developed as a forensic technique until 1985 in a laboratory in Leicester, England, almost by accident, by a geneticist named Alec Jeffreys, who was originally studying inherited disease markers and stumbled onto something with far larger implications. It wouldn't become a standard courtroom-ready tool for American law enforcement until years after that. In 1974, without a confession, without an eyewitness who could place McCurley specifically at that scene, and without any forensic method that could turn the biological evidence recovered from Carla's body and clothing into proof, prosecutors had a suspect they couldn't charge. A firearm match and a shaky alibi are suspicion. They are not on their own a case a district attorney can walk into a courtroom with and expect to win. McCurley was released, and the file on Carla Walker's murder did the thing that cases without a clear next step tend to do. It didn't close exactly, but it slowed. Fewer leads, fewer active hours logged against it, the particular quiet momentum loss that happens when an investigation runs directly into the ceiling of what the era's science can actually prove. That ceiling would stay in place for the next 46 years. This is the part of the story that gets skipped in most retellings. And it's arguably the part that matters most because it's not one story anymore. It's two, running in parallel, in the same city, for nearly half a century without ever touching. For the Walker family, the years after 1974 were built around an absence that never resolved. Jim Walker grew up, not past the case, but around it, the way a tree grows around an obstacle it can't move. He's described the feeling that settled into him during those years as a kind of quiet, constant anger with nowhere to land because there was no name attached to it yet. Anger needs a direction. His didn't have one for 46 years. His parents lived out the rest of their lives without ever learning who took their daughter. That's worth stating in the plainest possible terms, because it's easy to let a detail like that blur into the general sadness of the story instead of landing with its actual weight. Two people spent decades, the majority of the remainder of their lives, carrying an unanswered question that never got answered before they died. Jim Walker would eventually have to bury both of them. Still without a name, still without the thing every single one of them had wanted more than anything else. The case itself didn't vanish from Fort Worth Police Department's files. It stayed open. The kind of open that means a folder in a filing cabinet occasionally gets pulled back out, dusted off, reread by whoever's turn it is to look at it next, and then filed away again. When nothing new emerges, detectives who worked it in the 1970s and 80s would, decades later, describe still thinking about the case long after they'd retired, an itch that never fully went away, a name they never got to write down. Now shift the frame. A few miles away, in the same city, under the same sky, Glenn Samuel McCurley was living an entirely different kind of life. He worked, he married, he raised children, and in one of the details that only becomes unsettling with the full context, the kind of coincidence a city the size of Fort Worth produces more often than people expect, his own children attended school alongside Jim Walker, Carla's younger brother. Whether that was pure coincidence or something closer to a man who had learned correctly that he could simply continue existing inside the same community he'd taken a life from, is a question the record can't answer with certainty. What the record can tell us is this: for 46 years, nothing outside of that one inconclusive 1974 interview ever connected Glenn McCurley to Carla Walker's death. Two clocks running at completely different speeds in the same small radius of Texas. One frozen around a question that never got answered. One simply continuing year after year, as if the question had never been asked. It's worth pausing here before the science arrives to say something plainly. Cold case is a phrase that sounds procedural, clinical, something that lives inside a filing system. For the people living inside one, it isn't procedural at all. It's a specific kind of daily weight, The particular experience of going to sleep every night for over 4 decades without knowing whether the person responsible for the worst thing that ever happened to your family is dead, or has moved away, or is living 3 streets over, buying groceries at the same store you do. Rodney McCoy carried a version of that weight too, one shaped slightly differently. For years, in a small city where everyone half remembers everyone else's business, he lived with the knowledge that some portion of the community had quietly wondered about him, the boyfriend who survived, the one piece of the story that could never fully explain the gap in his own memory of what happened. He's described it simply as a cloud that never fully lifted, not because anyone formally accused him of anything, because in the absence of an actual answer, suspicion doesn't need a formal accusation. It just needs a gap and enough time to settle in and stay. That's the emotional terrain this case occupied for 46 years. Not a mystery in the entertainment sense of the word, a wound that simply never got the chance to close, because the one thing that could close it hadn't been invented yet. By the late 2010s, something had shifted that had nothing directly to do with Carla Walker, and everything to do with what would eventually solve her case. Home DNA testing had become, almost overnight by historical standards, a mainstream hobby. Millions of ordinary people were spitting into tubes and mailing them off, not out of any interest in criminal justice, but out of simple curiosity. Where did my family come from? Who are my cousins? What does my ancestry actually look like on paper? Consumer genealogy databases swelled with tens of millions of voluntarily submitted genetic profiles. Somewhere in the middle of that boom, a handful of forensic scientists and cold case investigators started asking a different kind of question. Not can we match this crime scene DNA to a known offender in a criminal database, which is what traditional forensic DNA testing had always done, and which fails completely the moment your suspect has never been arrested for anything before. Instead, what if we treated crime scene DNA the exact same way these millions of ordinary people were treating their own, as a genealogical puzzle, to be solved by finding relatives rather than a fingerprint, to be matched against a single known target? That question is the entire foundation of forensic genetic genealogy. Here's how it actually works, stripped down to its real mechanics rather than the compressed television version. Investigators take a DNA sample, often degraded, often decades old, often barely usable by older standards, and instead of asking, "Does this match anyone in our existing criminal database?" they build out a full genetic profile and compare it against enormous genealogical databases, the same ones ordinary hobbyists use. That comparison doesn't usually turn up the suspect directly. It turns up relatives. A second cousin here, a third cousin there. People with no idea their DNA is being used for anything beyond their own family tree research, who nonetheless share enough genetic material with a decades-old crime scene sample to become a starting thread. From there, the work becomes almost archival. Genealogists build out full family trees from those partial matches: birth records, marriage licenses, obituaries, census data. The entire paper trail a family leaves behind across generations, until an entire network of relatives takes shape on a page. Then investigators apply the same logic any homicide detective would recognize. Who in this family tree was the right age in 1974? Who lived in or near Fort Worth? Who fits whatever physical description exists? It's slow. It's unglamorous. A single case can involve hundreds of names across 4 or 5 generations before it narrows down to a short list of real, living, identifiable people. But by 2019 and 2020, this method had already cracked cases that had been sitting cold for 30, 40, even 50 years. Cases where the DNA had been sitting in an evidence locker the entire time, simply waiting for a database, and a technique that hadn't existed yet. The way Carla Walker's case actually got moving again is, in its own way, one of the stranger details in the entire story. In April of 2020, her case was featured on a cable true crime series called The DNA of Murder with Paul Holes, a show built around a real cold case investigator, a man who had spent decades of his career working unsolved homicides, including a leading role in the investigation that finally identified the man known for years only as the Golden State Killer. Holes wasn't formally assigned to Carla Walker's case. He simply reviewed it, the way he'd reviewed hundreds of cold cases before it, and something about it stuck with him enough that, shortly after the episode aired, he reached out and connected two Fort Worth detectives, Leah Wagner and Jeff Bennett, the investigators who had inherited this file decades after the original detectives who worked it had long since retired, with the forensic laboratory he'd seen produce results on other impossible cases. That laboratory was Othram, a Texas-based facility built specifically around the hardest DNA samples in existence, the degraded, decades-old, barely there biological material that standard forensic labs had already written off as unusable. There's something worth noting here about how this case actually got its second chance. It wasn't a routine reopening triggered by internal policy. It was a chain of small, specific decisions. A television producer choosing this case out of hundreds of possible cold cases to feature. A retired investigator with a genuine, lasting interest in unsolved homicides watching that episode and picking up a phone. Two detectives willing to pursue a lead that had already failed the department once, 46 years earlier. Remove any one link in that chain, and there's a real chance this story doesn't have an ending at all. The biological evidence recovered from Carla's body and clothing back in 1974 had spent 46 years in storage, not in ideal, climate-controlled conditions built for the future, because nobody had any way of knowing what the future would eventually be able to do with it. Just standard evidence storage, doing its best against 46 years of simple time. Some of what remained was too far gone to work with. DNA recovered from Carla's dress, when finally tested using modern techniques, turned out to be too weak and too incomplete to build a usable profile from on its own. But a separate sample, DNA recovered from her bra, had held up. It was degraded, difficult, exactly the kind of sample that a standard crime lab would have set aside as a lost cause. It was also exactly the kind of sample Othram had been built to handle, where conventional forensic DNA testing typically reads a few dozen genetic markers, enough to compare against a known suspect, but not enough to build out a meaningful family tree. Othram's sequencing methods could access hundreds of thousands of markers from the same tiny amount of material. That difference in scale is the entire reason this case was unsolvable in 1974, unsolvable through routine testing even as late as the 2000s, and solvable, finally, once the right kind of laboratory got the right kind of access to it. It had also already failed one test that mattered enormously to the investigation. Back when the case was periodically revisited over the decades, the DNA evidence had been run against CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national criminal database that every U.S. crime lab checks new evidence against. It came back with no hits. Not because the science had failed, because CODIS only contains people who have already been arrested and processed into it. If your suspect has never been arrested for anything serious enough to land him in that system, CODIS will never find him, no matter how many times you run the sample. That single fact is worth sitting with, because it's the clearest possible illustration of exactly why this case needed a completely different kind of science. not just a more advanced version of the old one. Glenn McCurley was never going to show up in a criminal database. His approach for 46 years, whether by luck or by design, had been to simply live a life that never put him back in a system built to catch people through their own criminal history. Genetic genealogy doesn't need a suspect's own history. It needs a family tree. And everybody has one of those, whether they've ever been arrested or not. When the profile built from Carla's bra sample was finally run against genealogical databases, it didn't return a name. It returned a family. Genetic matches pointed toward relatives living in Denton County, north of Fort Worth. Second and third cousins, the kind of distant genetic connection that requires real genealogical labor to turn into something useful. Investigators and genealogists worked outward from those matches, building the family tree branch by branch, name by name, until it narrowed to a specific set of candidates. 3 brothers, all sharing the surname McCurley. For anyone who had spent real time with this case file over the decades, that name would have landed with an entirely different weight than it would for anyone hearing it for the first time. Because it wasn't unfamiliar. It was the same family name that had already been sitting inside Carla Walker's file since 1974. The man with the matching pistol, the shaky story about a stolen gun, the interview that went nowhere for lack of anything more than suspicion. 46 years later, science that hadn't existed yet in 1974 had walked itself directly back to the same door Fort Worth detectives had already knocked on once. A genetic genealogy match narrows a family tree. It doesn't on its own prove which specific person inside that tree committed a crime. That last crucial step still belongs to old-fashioned detective work, the kind that doesn't require a laboratory at all. Detectives Wagner and Bennett needed a direct DNA sample from Glenn McCurley himself, obtained in a way that would hold up in court. So they did what cold case investigators have done in similar situations across the country. They watched, they waited, and they collected something he had already discarded. McCurley, 77 years old by this point, was under quiet surveillance. At some point during that surveillance, he stopped at a McDonald's, drank from a straw, and threw it away. An entirely ordinary, forgettable action, the kind of thing a person does 1,000 times, without ever thinking about it again. Detectives recovered that straw. The DNA on it was compared directly against the genetic profile built from the evidence in Carla Walker's case. It matched. 46 years after Glenn McCurley sat across from Fort Worth detectives and told them he'd never met Carla Walker, that a stranger had simply stolen the gun that matched the crime scene evidence. A discarded drinking straw finally said otherwise. On September 21, 2020, Fort Worth police took Glenn Samuel McCurley into custody and charged him with the capital murder of Carla Walker. At the press conference announcing the arrest, Jim Walker stood alongside the investigators who had finally closed the gap he'd been living inside since he was 12 years old. He would describe the moment later, using a single word that had apparently been sitting ready in him for a very long time. Finally. 46 years, 5 months, and 3 days after that early morning sound outside his bedroom window, Jim Walker finally had what he'd spent his entire adult life without: a name, a face. For Rodney McCoy, the arrest meant something specific too: the lifting, at last, of a cloud that had never fully gone away. The quiet suspicion that had shadowed him for over 4 decades simply because no one else had ever been formally connected to that night. And for the detectives who'd inherited this file, some of them not even born yet when Carla Walker died, the arrest was proof that the work their predecessors had done in 1974 hadn't been wasted. After all, it had simply been waiting patiently in a filing cabinet for the rest of the world's science to arrive and finish what it started. Glenn McCurley's trial began nearly a year later, In August of 2021, in a Tarrant County courtroom in front of Judge Elizabeth Beach. For the first several days, he maintained the same story he'd apparently been telling himself and everyone around him for 47 years. Not guilty. His defense argued that the physical evidence tying him to the scene was weaker than prosecutors claimed, and that anything he'd said to detectives during his 2020 interrogation had been coerced out of an elderly ailing man who was simply telling investigators whatever he thought would make the questioning stop. Then prosecutors played the interrogation video for the jury. What that video shows is not a single dramatic confession, it's something slower, and in its own way, more unsettling. A portrait of a story collapsing in real time, one layer at a time, over the course of more than an hour. McCurley begins by denying everything. He'd never seen her, never met her, never talked to her, wouldn't recognize her if she were standing next to him. He tells detectives more than once that he isn't the kind of person capable of something like this. Detectives, calm and unhurried, keep laying out what the evidence had already proven to be true. Slowly, McCurley's account starts to bend. He admits to being present that night after all. Then he offers a version where he's cast himself as something closer to a rescuer than an attacker, describing Carla as grateful to him for supposedly getting her away from a dangerous situation with her boyfriend. That version doesn't hold either, because it can't, because it doesn't match anything else known about that night. Eventually, the story breaks down completely, and McCurley admits what the DNA had already confirmed, that he assaulted her and that in his own account, he strangled her out of fear once the situation had gone further than he says he intended. Jurors watched this unfold across a video that ran for well over an hour. Several people in the courtroom gallery reportedly walked out in tears during the playback. It's worth pausing on that detail. Not for its shock value, but for what it actually tells you about what a confession like this does to the people forced to sit through it. It isn't relief. There's no clean, satisfying resolution in watching a man finally admit, 47 years late, to the worst thing that ever happened to your family. What it does instead is replace decades of uncertainty with something far heavier: certainty. Every detail a family had spent 46 years trying not to fully imagine, confirmed out loud in the voice of the man responsible. Rodney McCoy took the stand during the trial and for the first time in a courtroom setting described that night in his own words: the gun that failed to fire, the blows to his head, the sound of Carla's voice telling her attacker to stop hurting him. And finally, the last thing he ever heard her say, a request to go get her father. He also spoke about the 47 years that followed, the particular specific weight of having survived a night he could never fully account for, and having lived in the years since with the quiet awareness that some part of the community around him had never entirely stopped wondering about the one piece of the story that had never made complete sense. Testifying for Rodney wasn't simply about providing facts to a jury. It was the first time in nearly half a century that he got to put his own account of that night into a room where it would finally definitively be believed. On the third day of trial, before the jury ever reached a verdict, something shifted. Judge Beach informed the courtroom that she had received a signed document from Glenn McCurley, a written confession, along with a formal request to change his plea from not guilty to guilty. McCurley stood. He was sworn in. He waived his right to continue the jury trial, and he pleaded guilty to the capital murder of Carla Walker. Prosecutors had already made the decision months earlier not to pursue the death penalty. That wasn't leniency. It was strategy, built around certainty. A guilty plea and a life sentence meant no lengthy appeals process stretching years or decades into the future, no possibility of a retrial reopening the entire case, No chance the Walker family would be pulled back into a courtroom a second or third time for something they had already waited 46 years to see resolved once. Judge Elizabeth Beach sentenced Glenn Samuel McCurley to life in prison. In the courtroom, Carla's sister, Cindy Stone, addressed him directly. She described who Carla actually was. Not an abstraction, not a case file, but a specific, real person she had shared a childhood bedroom with for 17 years. She told him plainly that he'd had choices that night, many of them, at every single point along the way, and that he had chosen, deliberately, to go looking for someone to hurt. Jim Walker would later describe that moment not simply as justice for his sister, but as a kind of healing that reached beyond his own family entirely, something the whole surrounding community had been quietly waiting decades to feel resolved. Glenn Samuel McCurley spent just under 2 years in prison following his conviction. He died on July 14, 2023. It's worth doing the actual math out loud rather than letting it pass by as a footnote. McCurley evaded any consequence for Carla Walker's murder for 49 years. He served less than 2 behind bars. There's no way to frame that arithmetic so that it resolves into something that feels fully fair for Carla Walker. That wait lasted almost half a century for the people who loved her and who never once let her file close, not in 1974 and not in any of the 46 years that came after. It was far, far too long, but it was not forever. There's a particular kind of quiet that exists in rural Korea in the autumn. Rice paddies stretching out flat and gold on either side of a narrow road, the sound of insects, the occasional bicycle, bell from someone heading home before dark. Hwaseong, in 1986, was exactly that kind of place. Small, agricultural, the sort of town where a stranger walking down the wrong road at night would have been noticed by someone somewhere within minutes. That's what made what happened there so difficult for anyone to accept at the time and for decades afterward, because whoever was doing this wasn't a stranger passing through. He knew the paths between the rice fields. He knew which roads had no lighting. He knew, with a precision that terrified investigators long before they understood why, exactly how to disappear into a landscape that shouldn't have let anyone disappear at all. Between 1986 and 1991, 10 women were found murdered in and around this one small town. The case would go on to become the largest criminal investigation in South Korean history. Over 2 million police officers logging hours against it, more than 21,000 people questioned, tens of thousands of fingerprints taken. And at the end of all of it, for 33 years, the file stayed exactly where it started, unsolved. This is the story of the Hwaseong murders, how a small farming town became the site of the case that changed Korean law enforcement forever. Why the answer took over 3 decades to arrive, and what it actually felt like to finally get one, long after the law itself had stopped being able to do anything about it. It's the evening of September 19, 1986. A woman is walking home along a road that runs beside a drainage ditch and a stretch of open field, a route she has probably walked hundreds of times before. One she likely knows well enough not to think about it all. She's 71 years old. It's the kind of ordinary evening that never makes it into anyone's memory, because nothing about it seems worth remembering. She never makes it home. Her body is found the next day, in the field beside that same road, strangled with her own clothing. There are almost no other details for investigators to work from. No witnesses, no obvious motive, nothing to suggest this was anything other than a single isolated act of violence against a woman with, as far as anyone can tell, no enemies in the world. On its own, a killing like this, however horrifying, doesn't necessarily announce itself as the beginning of something larger. Small towns have tragedies, and tragedies, as devastating as they are usually just that: singular, contained, explainable eventually by something as simple as an argument or a robbery gone wrong. Investigators in September of 1986 have no particular reason yet to believe this is anything other than exactly that. One of the detectives assigned to that first scene is a young officer named Hwaseong. He walks the field. He notes the details, and then, like everyone else involved, he moves on to the next case on his desk because there is, at this point, no reason at all to think he'll still be thinking about this same field 30 years later. That changes 1 month later. In October, a 25-year-old woman is found dead under nearly identical circumstances, strangled with her own clothing, left in a rural area with no clear motive attached. Then in December, 2 more, within 2 days of each other. By January of 1987, a 5th victim, 19 years old. This is the point where the case stops being a collection of separate files and becomes, in the minds of the detectives working it, one single, continuous thread. Every scene carries the same unmistakable signature, the same method, the same rural roads, the same absence of anything a witness could hold on to. This isn't a string of coincidences. It's one person returning again and again to the same landscape, and growing more confident each time he does. Jung-Yoo is still on the case by this point, and he starts doing something that will end up mattering enormously. 33 years later, he begins keeping his own personal investigative diary, separate from the official case file, tracking details, timelines, and instincts that don't always fit neatly into a formal police report. He has no way of knowing yet that these notes will still exist, still matter, still be referenced by name in news coverage decades after most of the other detectives on this case have retired, or passed away, or simply moved on to other work. Word spreads quickly in a small town, and by early 1987, Hwaseong has transformed into a place living under a curfew nobody officially imposed. Women stop walking home alone after dark. Families rearrange entire routines, work schedules, school pickups, evening errands, around a fear that until recently would have been unthinkable in a place this quiet. And still, the killings don't stop. Over the next 4 years, the death toll climbs to 10 confirmed murders, the victims ranging from a 13-year-old schoolgirl to a woman in her 70s, a range so wide it defies the kind of narrow victim profile investigators usually rely on to narrow a suspect pool. He isn't targeting one type of woman. He's targeting opportunity wherever and whenever it presents itself. That's the question that comes to define this entire case for the next 3 decades, and the one question Hwaseong will still be asking himself long after his official assignment to it ends. How do you find a man who isn't following any pattern you can actually predict? By the time the killings reached their 3rd and 4th year, this had stopped being a local police matter and had become, functionally, a national crisis. The numbers alone are worth sitting with, because they tell you something the crimes themselves can't. This wasn't a case that lacked effort. Over 2 million individual man-days of police work were logged against it. More than 21,000 people were formally investigated as suspects or witnesses. Over 40,000 sets of fingerprints were taken. Hundreds of DNA and hair samples were collected and compared, using whatever forensic capability Korea had access to at the time. And that last detail is the one this entire story eventually turns on, because in the late 1980s, that capability was startlingly limited. Korea, at this point, didn't yet have reliable infrastructure for even basic blood type testing, let alone the kind of DNA analysis that was just beginning to emerge in parts of the West. Investigators were, in a very real sense, trying to solve a modern crime with the forensic tools of an earlier era. Here's where this case takes one of its most quietly devastating turns, and it's worth slowing down for, because it's the exact moment the killer very nearly got caught and didn't because of a single analytical error that nobody involved would fully understand for another 3 decades. Early forensic analysis on evidence from the case produced a blood type for the suspect, type B. From that point forward, every investigative lead, every suspect list, every round of questioning across the following years was filtered through that single data point. If you didn't have type B blood, you were, for practical purposes, no longer someone the investigation was actively pursuing. The actual killer had type O decades later. Once the truth finally surfaced, investigators would spend real time trying to understand exactly where that error came from. A lab mistake, a contaminated sample, a misread result, passed down through the chain of an investigation too large and too under pressure to double-check its own foundational assumptions. Nobody has ever been able to say with total certainty which point in that chain broke first. What we do know is this: a man who would go on to be tied to at least 5 of the 10 murders had, at some point during this investigation, actually been questioned as part of the broader suspect pool and was excluded on the basis of a blood type that turned out to be wrong. Sit with that for a moment, because it's the single most important fact in the entire first act of this story. The killer wasn't hiding in some undetectable margin outside the investigation's reach. For a period of time, he may have been sitting directly inside it, and a piece of flawed science quietly walked him back out the door. Hwaseong, by now one of the senior investigators on the case, would later say that this particular error, a single mistaken data point, treated as gospel across years of investigation, never fully left him, even decades afterward. He kept his personal notes on the case long after his formal role in it ended, revisiting his own theories on quiet evenings the way some people return to an unfinished crossword. Whatever instinct had first made him start that private diary back in 1986, it hadn't gone away just because the leads had. The pressure to produce an arrest after years of an unsolved case terrorizing an entire region eventually led to one of the darkest chapters connected to this investigation, one that had nothing to do with the actual killer at all. In connection with the 8th of the 10 murders, police secured a confession from a young man and built a case against him. He was convicted, and he would go on to spend 20 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. It would take decades and the eventual identification of the real killer before the truth about that 8th case fully came out. It had in fact been a copycat crime carried out by someone entirely separate from the man responsible for the other 9 murders, and the person convicted for it wasn't even that copycat. He was simply the person the pressure of an unsolved, high-profile investigation eventually settled on. This detail matters for understanding the full weight of what this case actually cost. It isn't only the 10 women who were killed and the families who spent decades without an answer. It's also a man who lost 20 years of his own life to a wrongful conviction inside an investigation so desperate for resolution that it produced an answer that felt satisfying without actually being true. When the real killer finally confessed, decades later, one of the first things he reportedly did was apologize directly to the man who had served time for a crime that was never his. In April of 1991, the 10th and final confirmed murder in the Hwaseong series took place. And then, as abruptly as it began, it stopped. There was no arrest, no confrontation, no dramatic final chapter that gave investigators or the town any sense of resolution. The killing simply ended, and for years afterward, Nobody could say with any confidence why. Some retired investigators would later speculate about what might cause a pattern like this to stop cold. A life circumstance changing, a marriage, a birth, something that altered the day-to-day rhythm that had for 5 years apparently made this kind of violence possible. But speculation isn't an answer. And for the people living in Hwaseong, an ending without a name attached to it wasn't really an ending at all. It was simply a pause, with no way of knowing whether it was permanent. Under South Korean law at the time, criminal cases carried a statute of limitations, a fixed window after which, regardless of any evidence that might later emerge, a suspect could no longer be legally prosecuted for the crimes involved in the Hwaseong murders. That window was 15 years. As the 1990s gave way to the 2000s, that clock kept running, case by case, whether or not anyone involved wanted it to. And on April 2nd, 2006, it finally expired entirely. The 15-year window closing on the 10th and final murder in the series. From that date forward, a fact settled into place that would define the entire rest of this story, no matter what happened next, even if the killer were identified with absolute, unquestionable certainty. He could never be criminally punished for what he'd done in Hwaseong. The law itself had run out of time before the truth did. That's worth letting sink in fully, because it changes the entire emotional shape of everything that follows. This isn't, in the end, a story that builds toward a courtroom verdict the way a case like Carla Walker's did. It's a story that builds toward something stranger and more complicated, the arrival of an answer that could never come with the consequence everyone had spent decades hoping for. Unsolved as it was, the Hwaseong case never actually left Korean public memory. If anything, it grew larger the longer it stayed unresolved. In 2003, director Bong Joon-ho released a film called Memories of Murder, loosely built around the frustration and desperation of detectives chasing a killer they could never quite catch. The film became one of the most acclaimed pieces of Korean cinema ever made, and in doing so, it cemented the Hwaseong case permanently into the country's cultural memory. Long after most active investigators had moved on to other work. There's something worth noting about that fact on its own. An entire generation of Koreans grew up knowing this case, not primarily through news coverage, but through a piece of art built around its unresolved horror. The murders became, in a very real sense, a story the country told itself about the limits of justice, about what it means to live with a wound that both the science and the law of the time simply weren't equipped to close. Which raises the question that carries this entire story into its final act. If the case had already outlived its own legal window, if the killings had stopped, if the file had been quietly gathering dust for over a decade, what would it actually take, finally, to put a name to it? Before this story gives him a name, it's worth knowing, briefly, who was actually living inside Hwaseong this entire time. Not to explain away anything that follows, but because the ordinariness of it is part of what makes this case what it is. Lee Chun-jae was born in Hwaseong in January of 1963. By every account from people who knew him growing up, there was nothing that marked him out. A reasonably educated young man, described by his own mother as someone who got along fine with others. He had a younger brother who drowned in childhood, a loss that reportedly affected him deeply. He graduated high school in 1983, served his mandatory military duty as a tank operator, and was discharged in January of 1986, just 8 months before the first Hwaseong murder. That's the entire biography available for the person who, for the next 5 years, would become the reason an entire town stopped sleeping. Not a stranger who arrived from somewhere else. Not someone who stood out in any way the community could have flagged in advance. just a young, recently discharged local man walking the same roads as everyone else. In 2010, Korean authorities assembled something that had nothing directly to do with the Hwaseong case, a DNA database of the country's prison population, built for entirely routine purposes of tracking and identifying repeat offenders across unrelated crimes. 9 years later, that database would become the single most important piece of infrastructure in solving a 33-year-old mystery, not because anyone built it with this case in mind, but because of a much simpler, much stranger fact. The man responsible for the Hwaseong murders had, since 1994, already been sitting inside the Korean prison system, serving a life sentence for an entirely different crime. In 1994, 3 years after the Hwaseong killings had stopped, a man named Lee Chun-jae raped and murdered his own sister-in-law. He was caught, tried, and convicted, and sentenced to life in prison for that single crime, the only offense at that point formally connected to his name in any legal record anywhere. For the next 25 years, Lee Chun-jae existed inside the Korean prison system as exactly that, a man serving a life sentence for one murder, with no formal connection whatsoever to the case that had terrorized an entire region a decade before his arrest. His DNA had been in that 2010 prison database the entire time. Nobody had any reason yet to run it against evidence from a case that had already closed its own legal window years earlier. What finally changed wasn't a new lead, or a new witness, or a new confession from someone connected to the original case. It was a shift in the underlying science itself. By the late 2010s, forensic laboratories had developed advanced DNA restoration and amplification techniques, methods capable of extracting usable genetic profiles from biological evidence that was decades old, badly degraded, and far below the threshold that older DNA testing methods could work with at all. This is functionally the same category of advancement that would go on to crack cases like Carla Walker's on the other side of the world. Science finally catching up to evidence that had been sitting unusable for far longer than anyone originally expected it would need to. Investigators went back to the original physical evidence from the Hwaseong case, preserved for over 30 years, in some cases barely intact, and applied this newer technology to it, from a badly degraded sample tied to one of the earlier murders. They were able to build a usable genetic profile for the first time in the case's entire history. That profile was run against Korea's prison DNA database. It matched Lee Chun-jae. On September 18, 2019, South Korean police announced what the country had spent 33 years believing might never actually happen. They had identified a suspect in the Hwaseong serial murders. Follow-up testing confirmed DNA matches tying Lee Chun-jae to at least 3 of the original 10 cases, with further evidence eventually connecting him to additional murders in the series. He was, at the time of the announcement, 56 years old, already 25 years into a life sentence for the killing of his sister-in-law, a man the public had had no reason to think about in connection with this case at all. For a country that had spent over 3 decades treating this case as a kind of permanent, unhealed wound in its own history, the announcement landed with a weight that's genuinely difficult to overstate. This wasn't simply the resolution of a single file. It was the answer to a question an entire nation had been living beside for longer than most of its citizens had been alive. One image circulated widely in the days after the announcement, and it's worth describing rather than skipping past, because it captures something words alone don't quite manage. Investigators placed Lee Chun-jae's high school graduation photograph side by side with the facial composite sketch police had circulated back in the late 1980s, built from the limited witness descriptions available at the time. Looking at the 2 images together, the resemblance is difficult to miss. A face the public had, in a strange and unsettling way, technically already seen decades earlier, without any way of knowing what they were looking at. For Hwaseong, the young detective who had walked that first field back in September of 1986, who had kept his own private notes on the case for over 3 decades after his official assignment to it ended, the identification arrived after a professional lifetime spent circling the same unanswered question. He had long since retired by 2019. He would later say that the moment he learned a name had finally been attached to the case, the first thing he did was go back through his own old notebooks, checking his decades-old instincts against a face he had never actually seen coming. DNA evidence alone, even a confirmed match, doesn't automatically produce a confession, and Lee Chun-jae's initial response to being confronted followed a pattern familiar to investigators. Everywhere, denial. Detectives conducted more than 10 separate interrogation sessions with him inside the prison where he was already serving his existing sentence. Each time, according to investigators, he maintained that he had no connection to the Hwaseong murders, despite the DNA evidence already sitting in front of them. There's a specific kind of tension worth naming here, one that's different from most true crime cases. The man being questioned had, by this point, nothing left to legally lose. He was already serving a life sentence. He knew almost certainly that the statute of limitations on the Hwaseong murders had expired years earlier, meaning that even a full confession couldn't add a single additional day to his existing punishment. And still, for weeks, he denied everything anyway. What eventually changed wasn't legal pressure. It was something closer to the simple, accumulating weight of evidence that no longer left any room for denial to make logical sense. By late September and into early October of 2019, Lee Chun-jae's denials began to give way. He confessed ultimately, not just to the Hwaseong murders, but to a total of 14 killings, the original 10, plus 4 additional murders investigators hadn't previously connected to him at all, along with more than 30 rapes and attempted rapes across the same period. His confession went beyond a simple admission of guilt. He provided investigators with specific, granular details about individual crime scenes, details about the layout of locations, about how certain victims had been positioned, information that, according to the detectives who took his statement, could only have been known by the person who was actually there. For the families who had spent over 3 decades without a name, this level of detail served a specific, painful purpose. It removed any lingering possibility of doubt. He also, during this process, addressed the case of the man wrongfully convicted for the 8th murder in the series, the young man who had spent 20 years in prison for a crime he never committed. Lee reportedly offered a direct apology, acknowledging that the murder in question had actually been carried out by an unrelated copycat and that an innocent man had paid the price for a crime connected to his own pattern of violence but not actually committed by him. Here is the fact that makes this case unlike almost any other in this genre, and it's worth sitting with fully rather than rushing past. Despite a confirmed DNA match and a detailed personal confession to 10 murders, Lee Chun-jae could not be prosecuted for a single one of them. The statute of limitations that had expired back in 2006 didn't pause or reset or bend to accommodate new evidence, no matter how conclusive. South Korean law, as written at the time these crimes were committed, simply didn't allow it. Lee Chun-jae would continue serving out the life sentence he already had for his sister-in-law's murder in 1994, with the Hwaseong case added permanently to his personal history, but never to his legal record of convictions. In July of 2020, following an extensive follow-up investigation, Korean police officially closed the case, formally confirming Lee Chun-jae's responsibility for the murders while stating plainly, and without any legal ambiguity, that he would face no additional punishment for them. It would be easy to describe this ending as hollow, And there's real truth in that description. Families who had waited over 3 decades for a name did not get to watch a trial. They did not get to hear a judge hand down a sentence tied specifically to what happened to the people they loved. In the most literal legal sense, nothing about their loss was ever formally punished. And yet, across nearly every interview given by family members and investigators in the years since 2019, the same idea surfaces again and again in different words, but the same essential shape: an answer. Even one that arrives without punishment attached to it is not nothing. For decades, families connected to this case lived with a specific, unresolved kind of uncertainty. Not just grief, but the added weight of never knowing, never having a face or a name to attach to what had happened, never being able to say with certainty that the person responsible wasn't still out there, still capable of doing it again. That particular uncertainty ended in 2019, even though the legal consequence never came. There's a difference. Investigators involved in the case have said, between a wound that never closes because there's no answer, and a wound that never closes because the answer arrived too late for the law to matter. Neither one is fair, but they are not the same kind of unfinished. The Hwaseong case's ending, a confirmed killer who could never be punished, became one of the most significant catalysts in modern Korean legal history for reforming how the country handles statutes of limitations on serious violent crime in the years following. And drawing directly on the public reaction to this case, South Korea moved to abolish the statute of limitations entirely for murder, ensuring that no future case could end the way this one did, with a confirmed confessed killer walking free of any additional legal consequence simply because too much time had passed before the evidence caught up. That's a legacy worth stating plainly. 10 women who were never able to see justice served for what happened to them nonetheless, changed the legal framework of an entire country, closing a loophole that might otherwise have protected some future killer the exact same way it protected this one. The man who spent 20 years in prison for the 8th murder, the one later confirmed to be an unrelated copycat crime, was formally exonerated once the truth of the case fully came to light. He had already served his sentence and been released years before the exoneration, but the formal clearing of his name mattered enormously, both to him and to a Korean justice system publicly, reckoning with exactly how a wrongful conviction had happened inside one of the most scrutinized investigations in the country's history. His story stands as its own quiet, separate tragedy inside this larger one, a reminder that the damage caused by an unsolved case that drags on for decades doesn't stop at the victims and their families. It can reach sideways into an entirely innocent life, simply because an investigation under enough pressure to produce an answer sometimes produces the wrong one. Memories of Murder remains, to this day, one of the most acclaimed films in Korean cinema, and its ending, filmed years before the real case was ever solved, has taken on an entirely new resonance since 2019. The film closes on its lead detective staring directly into the camera, having spent the entire story chasing a killer he was never able to catch, wondering aloud whether that killer might be standing somewhere in the audience watching. When Lee Chun-jae was finally identified, director Bong Joon-ho and the film's lead actor both spoke publicly about what it meant to watch a story they had built around unresolved horror finally arrive at a real answer more than 15 years after the film's release. That's a detail worth holding onto as this story closes. Some cases don't just haunt the people directly connected to them. They embed themselves into how an entire country understands its own capacity for both violence and patience, for the ability to keep looking, keep waiting, keep building better tools, even decades after most people involved had quietly stopped expecting an answer to ever come. There's a final image in Memories of Murder, The film built around this case years before it was ever solved, that Korean audiences have carried with them since 2003. The lead detective, older now, retired from the force, pulls over on a rural road and walks into a drainage ditch, the same kind of ordinary, unremarkable place where the first body in the film's story was found. He crouches down, looking at the empty ground where it happened. And then, slowly, he turns and looks directly into the camera, directly at the audience, as if the person he spent the whole story chasing might, after all this time, be sitting right there watching. For 16 years, that shot was fiction reaching for an answer reality hadn't provided yet. After September of 2019, it stopped being only that. Somewhere in South Korea, in an actual prison cell, was an actual man who actually had been standing in that actual field in 1986, and for over 3 decades, he actually had been, in some sense, sitting right there in the audience of his own unsolved crime, watching a nation search for him in books, in television specials, in a film that became one of the most acclaimed in the country's history, all without ever finding him. Hwaseong today is a very different place than it was in 1986, larger, more developed, closer in character to the growing edge of the greater Seoul metropolitan area than the small, quiet farming town it once was. The rice paddies that once bordered its darkest roads have, in many places, given way to new construction entirely. Somewhere underneath that development, if you knew exactly where to look, is the same field Hwaseong walked as a young detective in September of 1986, the one he was apparently still thinking about in his own private notebooks. 33 years later, 10 women lost their lives here between 1986 and 1991. One innocent man lost 20 years of his own life to a wrongful conviction connected to the same case. An entire country spent over 3 decades not knowing, and then, finally, in the space of a few weeks in the fall of 2019, knowing everything at once: a name, a face, a detailed confession, and the bitter, unavoidable fact that none of it could ever be formally punished. That's the story of the Hwaseong murders. Not simply a case that took 33 years to solve, but a case that changed what solving actually means once the answer arrives too late for the law to do anything with it at all.